The dust storm had torn through the valley 3 nights running, and Tessa Hamilton's only Sunday dress hung in ribbons around her knees as she stepped into the mercantile on that scorching July morning in 1882. She could feel every eye in Helena. Montana turned toward her the moment the bell above the door announced her entrance, and the familiar weight of shame settled across her shoulders like an unwelcome shawl. "Well, would you look at what the wind dragged in?" Margaret Thornton said loudly from where she stood examining bolts of calico near the window. Her voice carried through the store with the precision of someone who wanted every word heard. "I suppose some people think it is appropriate to walk through town looking like a scarecrow that lost a fight with a threshing machine." Tessa felt her face flush hot, but she kept her chin level and her eyes forward as she moved toward the counter where Mr. Peterson kept the dried goods. She had come for flour and coffee beans, and she would get what she needed and leave with whatever dignity she could gather. The dress had been her mother's once, passed down when consumption had taken her 5 years ago, and Tessa had mended it a dozen times already. The recent storms had simply been too much for fabric that had already given everything it had. "Honestly, you would think she would have the decency to stay home," another voice chimed in. This one belonged to Caroline Winters, whose father owned half the silver claims in the territory. "Some of us actually take pride in our appearance." Tessa's fingers tightened on the shopping list she carried, the paper crinkling in her grip. She had written it last night by candlelight, calculating every penny she had earned taking in washing and mending for the families who could afford such services. Her father had been a good man, a hard-working rancher, but a bad winter and a series of poor decisions had left them with more debt than cattle. After his heart gave out last spring, Tessa had been left with a failing ranch, a mortgage she could not pay, and pride that seemed to matter less with each passing day. "Miss Hamilton." Mr. Peterson's voice was neutral, professional, as he acknowledged her presence at the counter. He was a fair man, and Tessa appreciated that he did not join in the cruel commentary that seemed to follow her everywhere these days. "What can I get for you today?" She handed him the list, her voice steady despite the burning in her chest. "Just these items, please. I have the money." As Mr. Peterson gathered her goods, Tessa became aware of whispered conversation behind her. The words were meant to be overheard, meant to cut, and they did their job well. "I heard the bank is going to take her father's land," Margaret said in a stage whisper. "She will probably end up in one of those houses on the edge of town, if you know what I mean." "Margaret, really," Caroline replied, but her tone held more amusement than reproach. "Though I cannot imagine what else she would do. No decent man would want a wife who cannot even keep herself properly clothed." Tessa paid for her purchases, her hands trembling slightly as she counted out the coins. She had almost made it to the door, her small bag of supplies clutched against her chest, when the bell rang again, and someone stepped inside. The man who entered was tall and lean, with shoulders that spoke of hard work, and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same mountains that surrounded the town. He wore dusty trail clothes, a gun belt slung low on his hips, and a black hat that shadowed eyes the color of creek water after a storm. Tessa had seen him around Helena a few times in the past weeks, always at a distance, always moving with the kind of easy confidence that suggested he knew exactly who he was, and felt no need to prove it to anyone. She tried to slip past him, but he moved at the same moment and they nearly collided. His hand came up automatically to steady her, and she found herself looking directly into those gray-green eyes. "Pardon me, miss," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in her chest. "My fault," Tessa murmured, stepping back quickly. She needed to leave before the tears that threatened actually fell, before she gave Margaret and Caroline even more ammunition for their gossip. "Nathaniel Brooks," Margaret's voice rang out with sudden warmth, and Tessa realized the cowboy had a name now. "How wonderful to see you. I heard you just purchased the old Morrison spread east of town. 5,000 acres, is that right?" Tessa used the distraction to move toward the door, but Margaret's next words stopped her cold. "You simply must be careful about the company you keep here in Helena. Some people are not what they seem. Take that woman in the ragged dress, for instance. She is practically destitute, and yet she parades around town as though she has every right to shop alongside respectable folk." "That dress is an embarrassment," Caroline added. "Someone should tell her that poverty is no excuse for looking like she dressed in the dark, using clothes she pulled from a rag bag." Tessa's hand was on the door handle, and she was pulling it open when Nathaniel Brooks's voice cut through the mercantile like a knife through butter. "I have seen a lot of things in my travels," he said, and something in his tone made everyone fall silent. "I have seen women in Paris wearing gowns that cost more than most men make in a year. I have seen Spanish señoritas in silk and mantillas. I have seen society ladies in San Francisco dripping with jewels." He paused, and Tessa found herself turning despite herself, found herself meeting his gaze across the store. "But I have never seen anyone wear a dress with more dignity than that young woman right there. She does not make the dress. The dress should be honored. She is wearing it. She makes it look like royalty." The silence that followed was so complete that Tessa could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Margaret's mouth had fallen open, and Caroline looked like she had just swallowed a wasp. Even Mr. Peterson had paused in the act of cutting fabric, his scissors frozen in midair. Nathaniel Brooks tipped his hat to Tessa, his eyes never leaving hers. "Miss," he said simply, and then he turned his attention to Mr. Peterson. "I need supplies for a week. I will make a list." Tessa fled then, bursting out into the bright sunlight with her eyes blurring and her breath coming in short gasps. She made it halfway down the wooden sidewalk before she had to stop, pressing her back against the wall of the telegraph office and trying to collect herself. No one had defended her in so long. No one had spoken a kind word about her in months. The unexpected grace of it, the sheer decency, had shattered something inside her that she had been holding together with nothing but stubborn will. She did not cry. She had learned not to cry where people could see. But she stood there for a long moment, clutching her bag of supplies and trying to understand what had just happened. Nathaniel Brooks did not know her. He had no reason to speak on her behalf, and certainly no reason to risk offending women like Margaret Thornton, whose husband owned the largest hotel in Helena and had influence with everyone who mattered. When she finally started walking again, heading toward the edge of town where she had left her father's old mare tied to a post, Tessa tried to push the incident from her mind. It had been kind, unexpectedly and almost painfully kind, but it changed nothing. She still had a mortgage payment due in 2 weeks that she had no way of making. She still had a ranch that was falling apart around her ears and no money to fix it. She still had a future that looked darker with each passing day. The ride back to the ranch took an hour, and the sun was high and merciless by the time Tessa guided the mare up the rutted path to what had once been a respectable homestead. The house was small but sturdy, built by her father's hands 20 years ago when he had first claimed this land. The barn was less sound, listing slightly to one side, and the fences were in desperate need of repair. She had 6 cattle left from her father's herd of 50, 3 chickens that refused to lay eggs with any regularity, and a vegetable garden that she struggled to keep watered during the dry summer months. She put the mare in the barn, measuring out a careful portion of oats that she could barely afford, and then carried her supplies into the house. The interior was dim and cool, a relief after the heat outside. Tessa put the flour and coffee in the cupboard, then sank down into one of the two chairs that flanked the small kitchen table. For the first time since her father died, she let herself truly consider what Margaret had said. The bank was going to take the land. Tessa had known it was coming, had seen it approaching like a storm on the horizon, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way it had not been before. She had 30 days after the missed payment before they could legally foreclose. That gave her 6 weeks total to come up with $300. It might as well have been 3,000. It might as well have been the moon. She sat there as the light shifted and changed, as the afternoon wore on toward evening, trying to think of options and finding none. She could sell the cattle, but 6 head would bring maybe $60 at best. She could sell the mare, but then she would have no way to get to town or work the land. She could sell her mother's wedding ring, but it was silver, not gold, and would bring perhaps $10. The sound of hoofbeats on the path brought her head up. Visitors were rare, and for a moment Tessa felt a spike of fear. A woman alone on a failing ranch was vulnerable in ways she tried not to think about. But when she went to the window and looked out, she saw a single rider on a big bay gelding, and even from a distance, she recognized the set of those shoulders. Nathaniel Brooks reined in his horse in front of the house, and dismounted with the easy grace of someone who had spent more of his life in the saddle than out of it. He had a bundle of something tied behind his saddle, and he was reaching for it when Tessa opened the door and stepped out onto the narrow porch. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her voice uncertain, "can I help you?" He turned, and even with the hat shadowing his face, she could see the slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth. "Miss Hamilton, I hope I am not intruding. I realized after you left the mercantile that I never properly introduced myself, and I wanted to apologize for any embarrassment my words might have caused you." Tessa blinked. "Apologize? Mr. Brooks, you defended me, you said." She trailed off, not quite able to repeat his words. "I said what was true," he replied, moving toward the porch with the bundle in his hands. "But I also made you the center of attention when you clearly wanted to be anywhere else. That was thoughtless of me." He held out the bundle. "I hope you will accept this as an apology, though I also hope you will not be offended by it." Tessa took the package automatically, confused. It was heavier than she expected, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "What is this?" "Open it," he said simply. She did, carefully untying the string and folding back the paper. Inside was fabric, several yards of it, in a deep blue that reminded her of the sky just after sunset. It was cotton, practical and sturdy, but with a quality that made her breath catch. Beneath it was another package, smaller, containing thread, buttons, and a paper of pins. "Mr. Brooks, I cannot accept this," Tessa said immediately, even as her fingers traced the fabric with helpless longing. She had not had new cloth in 3 years. "It is too generous. We barely know each other." "I have money," he said bluntly. "More than I need, truth be told. And you have been working yourself to the bone trying to keep this place going after your father passed. That is what Mr. Peterson told me when I asked about you after you left. He said you have not bought a single thing for yourself in months, that every penny you earn goes to keeping food on the table and paying down debt." He paused. "He also said the bank is going to foreclose in 6 weeks. Tessa's hands tightened on the fabric, and she felt her pride rear up like a wild horse. "Mr. Peterson had no right to discuss my business with a stranger." "He cares about you," Nathaniel said quietly, "and he is worried. He told me because he hopes someone might be able to help, and he knows you are too proud to ask." "I can handle my own affairs," Tessa said, but her voice lacked conviction even to her own ears. "I am sure you can," Nathaniel agreed. "You have been doing it alone for a long time now. But there is no shame in accepting help when it is offered freely and with good intent." He gestured to the fabric in her hands. "If you will not take it as a gift, then take it as payment for services rendered." "I have rendered you no services," Tessa pointed out. "Not yet," he agreed. "But I am hoping you might. My new ranch house is in desperate need of curtains, and the previous owner left the place in such a state that I will need someone to help me make it livable. I heard you take in sewing. I would like to hire you." Tessa looked up at him, trying to read his face. His expression was open, honest, without a trace of the pity that would have made her refuse immediately. "Mr. Brooks, a few curtains would not require several yards of fabric and a sewing kit. Then make yourself a new dress first," he said. "Consider it an advance on the work." "I am a patient man, Miss Hamilton. I can wait for the curtains." She should refuse. Every instinct told her to hand the fabric back and send him on his way. She did not know this man, did not know what he wanted, or why he had singled her out for this strange kindness. But as she stood there with the blue fabric in her hands, and the afternoon sun beating down on her worn dress, Tessa found she could not form the words. The gift was too precious, too perfectly chosen, and the pride that would have made her refuse felt suddenly like a luxury she could no longer afford. "Thank you," she said finally, softly. "I will make your curtains, Mr. Brooks, and I will make them well." His smile was like sunrise, slow and warm and illuminating. "I have no doubt of that, Miss Hamilton, no doubt at all." He stayed for a few more minutes, just long enough to confirm the details of the work she would do for him. And then he mounted his bay gelding and rode back down the path toward his own property. Tessa stood on the porch long after he disappeared from view, holding the blue fabric against her chest and trying to understand the strange flutter in her stomach that his smile had caused. That evening, as the light faded and the heat finally broke, Tessa lit her lamp and spread the fabric out on the kitchen table. She had been sewing since she was 6 years old, taught by a mother who believed that every woman should know how to clothe herself and her family with skill and care. Tessa's stitches were small and even, her seams straight and strong, and as she began to cut the pattern for a new dress, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt hope. The dress took her 3 days to complete, working in the early mornings before the heat became unbearable, and in the evenings after she had finished the endless chores that kept the ranch barely functioning. She had no pattern to follow, but she did not need one. She had made so many dresses over the years that her hands seemed to know the shape of things by instinct. She cut and pinned and stitched, and with each seam she completed, she felt a little more like herself, a little less like the desperate woman who had been mocked in the mercantile. When it was finished, she stood in front of the small mirror in her bedroom and barely recognized herself. The dress fit perfectly, the blue fabric bringing out the color of her eyes and making her dark blonde hair look almost golden. It had a simple design, practical and modest, but there was a grace to the lines that made her look like someone worth noticing, someone worth knowing. She wore it the following Sunday when she drove into town for church, and the reaction was immediate. Heads turned as she walked through the doors, and for once, the whispers seemed to carry surprise rather than disdain. Margaret Thornton's lips pressed into a thin line when she saw Tessa, but she said nothing, perhaps still stinging from Nathaniel Brooks's rebuke the previous week. Tessa took her usual seat near the back, trying to ignore the attention and focus on the service. But halfway through Reverend Patterson's sermon about loving your neighbor, she became aware of someone sliding into the pew beside her. She glanced over and found Nathaniel Brooks settling in, his hat held in his hands and his Sunday clothes surprisingly well fitted for a rancher. "Morning, Miss Hamilton," he whispered, his voice low enough not to disturb those around them. "That is a fine dress. The color suits you." "Thank you," she whispered back, feeling warmth creep into her cheeks. "And thank you again for the fabric. I have started work on your curtains." "No rush," he said, and then fell silent as the sermon continued. Having him beside her was oddly comforting, his presence solid and steady in a way that made Tessa feel less alone than she had in months. When the service ended and the congregation filed outside into the bright morning, Nathaniel walked with her down the church steps, his hand hovering near her elbow in a gesture that was protective without being presumptuous. "Miss Hamilton," a voice called, and Tessa turned to see Mrs. Anderson hurrying toward her. She was an older woman, a widow who ran a boarding house on the north end of town, and she had always been kind to Tessa. "My dear, that dress is absolutely lovely. Did you make it yourself?" "I did, Mrs. Anderson," Tessa replied, surprised by the compliment. "I knew you were talented with a needle," Mrs. Anderson said warmly. "Would you be willing to make a dress for my niece? She is coming to visit next month, and I would like to have something special ready for her. She is about your size." Tessa felt something loosen in her chest. "I would be happy to, Mrs. Anderson. If you have fabric, I could start right away." "Wonderful," the older woman beamed. "Come by the boarding house tomorrow and we will discuss the details." She glanced at Nathaniel with obvious approval. "Mr. Brooks, it is good to see you in church. Will you be joining us regularly?" "I expect so, Mrs. Anderson," Nathaniel replied with easy courtesy. "It seems to be where the most interesting people gather on Sunday mornings." The older woman chuckled and moved off to speak with someone else, and Tessa found herself smiling despite herself. "You are going to have the entire town talking if you keep appearing at my side, Mr. Brooks." "Let them talk," he said, shrugging. "I am accustomed to gossip. It comes with the territory when you buy a large ranch and no one knows where you came from or how you made your money." He looked down at her, his gray-green eyes serious. "But if my attention is unwelcome, Miss Hamilton, you have only to say so and I will keep my distance." Tessa considered the question more carefully than he probably expected. She barely knew this man, and yet he had shown her more kindness in the span of a week than most people in Helena had shown her in the past year. He made her feel seen, valued, in a way that was both unsettling and deeply appealing. "Your attention is not unwelcome," she said finally, meeting his gaze. "But I would like to know more about you, Mr. Brooks. People are asking questions, and I find I have no answers to give them." "Then perhaps you would allow me to call on you," he suggested. "Properly, I mean. I could come by your ranch tomorrow evening and we could talk. I will tell you anything you want to know." Tessa's first instinct was to refuse. Having a man call on her felt dangerous, too much like hope, too much like wanting something she had convinced herself she could not have. But as she looked at Nathaniel Brooks, at the honest openness in his face and the patient waiting in his posture, she found herself nodding. "Tomorrow evening would be fine," she said. "I will make coffee." His smile was reward enough, bright and genuine and just for her. "I will look forward to it, Miss Hamilton." He tipped his hat and walked away to where his bay gelding was tied, mounting with fluid ease and riding off down the main street. Tessa watched him go, her heart doing complicated things in her chest, and wondered what exactly she had just agreed to. Nathaniel arrived the next evening just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Tessa had spent the afternoon cleaning the house with more care than usual, sweeping and dusting and putting wildflowers in a jar on the kitchen table. She told herself she was not being foolish, that it was simply polite to make the place presentable for a guest, but she knew she was lying to herself. She had changed into her new blue dress again, unable to help herself, and had spent an embarrassing amount of time pinning up her hair. When she heard hoofbeats on the path, she checked her reflection one final time and then forced herself to walk, not run, to the door. Nathaniel dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail, then climbed the steps with something held carefully in his hands. As he got closer, Tessa saw it was a pie, gold-encrusted and still warm. "I stopped by Mrs. Chen's bakery," he explained, looking almost sheepish. "I thought about trying to bake something myself, but I did not want to risk poisoning you on our first proper visit." Tessa laughed, the sound surprising her with its lightness. "That was very thoughtful. Please come in." The house was small enough that having him inside felt intimate, his tall frame seeming to fill the space in a way that was not quite comfortable but not entirely unwelcome either. Tessa served the coffee she had promised, and they sat at the kitchen table with slices of apple pie between them. "You wanted to know about me," Nathaniel began, wrapping his hands around the coffee cup. "I will start at the beginning. I was born in Missouri, on a farm that my father lost when I was 12. We moved west, following the promise of gold like half the country, and we ended up in California. My father died in the mines. My mother lasted 2 years longer before fever took her." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Tessa could hear the old pain beneath the words. "I am sorry," she said softly. "That must have been terribly hard." "It was," he agreed, "but it also taught me to rely on myself. I worked wherever I could find work. Ranches, mostly. I learned cattle and horses, learned how to read land and water rights, learned the business side of running a spread. I saved every penny I did not absolutely need to spend." He paused, sipping his coffee. 10 years ago, I got lucky. I was working for a man who owned a small silver claim he considered worthless. He offered to sell it to me for $100, money I had been saving to buy my own cattle. I took the gamble. "Let me guess," Tessa said, beginning to smile. "It was not worthless." "Not even close," Nathaniel confirmed. "It was not a huge strike, nothing like the big operations around Virginia City, but it was steady and rich enough. I worked it for 5 years, selling the ore and saving everything. When it finally played out, I had enough money to buy the life I wanted. A ranch, cattle, good land with water." He looked at her directly. "I have been looking for the right place for 2 years, and when I saw the Morrison spread, I knew it was what I had been searching for." "So you are a success story," Tessa said, but there was no bitterness in her words, only a kind of wondering admiration. "You came west with nothing and built something real." "I got lucky," Nathaniel corrected. "But yes, I built something. Now I want to build more, not just a ranch, but a life. A home." He hesitated, then added, "I am 28 years old, Miss Hamilton, and I have spent most of my life alone. I am tired of it." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something Tessa could not quite name. She looked down at her coffee, suddenly shy. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you asked," he said simply. "And because I want you to know that my interest in you is not charity and it is not pity. When I saw you in that mercantile, standing straight and proud despite everything those women were saying, I saw strength. I saw dignity. I saw someone who faces hard things and does not break." He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his skin. "I would like to know you better, Tessa, if you will let me." He had used her first name, and somehow that simple intimacy made her eyes sting with tears she refused to shed. "I am not looking for rescue," she said, needing him to understand. "I will not be some charity case for you to feel good about saving." "I am not looking to rescue anyone," Nathaniel replied, his voice firm but gentle. "I am looking for a partner, someone who understands hard work and values honesty, someone who knows what it means to fight for what matters. He did touch her hand then, his fingers rough and warm against hers. I think you might be that person, Tessa, but I am patient. I am willing to wait while you decide what you think of me. They talked until the stars came out, until the coffee grew cold and the pie was nothing but crumbs. Nathaniel told her about his plans for his ranch, about the cattle he wanted to raise, and the breeding program he hoped to start. Tessa told him about her father, about the good years before the bad ones, about her mother's garden and her own dreams of someday having enough security to plan beyond the next month. When he finally rose to leave, the moon was high and bright, casting silver light across the yard. Tessa walked him to the door and he paused on the threshold, looking down at her with an expression that made her breath catch. "Thank you for the evening," he said. "May I call on you again?" "Yes," Tessa said, the word coming easier than she expected. "I would like that." He smiled, touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was becoming familiar, and then mounted his horse and rode off into the night. Tessa stood on the porch watching until he disappeared, her hand pressed against her chest where her heart was beating too fast. She barely knew him. It was too soon to feel this way, too soon to let hope take root. But as she turned and went back inside, closing the door against the cool night air, Tessa could not quite bring herself to crush the small, bright feeling that had taken up residence somewhere near her ribs. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity that felt almost like happiness. Nathaniel called on her 3 more times, always bringing small gifts that were practical rather than frivolous. A sack of flour when hers ran low. A new harness for her mare when he noticed the old one was cracked and dangerous. Coffee beans and sugar, and, once, a book of poetry that he admitted he had bought years ago and never quite understood but thought she might enjoy. Tessa finished his curtains and delivered them herself, driving her wagon to his ranch on a Thursday afternoon when the heat was not quite unbearable. The house was larger than hers, built of good timber with a wide porch and real glass windows. Inside, it was sparsely furnished but clean, with the kind of order that spoke of a man who knew how to take care of himself. She hung the curtains while he watched, and when she stepped back to survey her work, she felt a quiet pride. They were simple but well made, the fabric a warm cream color that let in light while providing privacy. "They are perfect," Nathaniel said, coming to stand beside her. "You have a real gift, Tessa." "I have a lot of practice," she replied, but she was pleased. "Thank you for the work, Mrs. Anderson paid me for her niece's dress yesterday, and I have 2 more commissions from women who saw it." She hesitated, then added, "It is not enough to save the ranch, but it is more than I have had in a long time." "How much do you need?" Nathaniel asked bluntly. "For the bank, I mean." "To keep the land." Tessa stiffened. "I cannot take money from you, Nathaniel. I am not offering to give it to you," he said, his tone reasonable. "I am asking how much you need. There is a difference." $300, Tessa admitted, "due in 3 weeks. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him thinking, calculating. "What if I bought some of your land?" he suggested. "You have 100 acres, correct? What if I bought 50 acres at $6 an acre? That would give you the 300 you need, and you would still have 50 acres for yourself, enough to keep the house and a small herd." Tessa turned to look at him, searching his face for any sign of pity or condescension. She found neither, only honest interest. "You already have 5,000 acres, she pointed out. "You do not need my 50. "True," he agreed. "But your 50 acres share a border with my property, and there is a stream that runs through them. Water rights are valuable, Tessa. I would be getting something real out of the deal, not just helping you." He paused. "But if you do not want to sell, I will not push. I just hate to see you lose everything when there might be an option." It was a fair offer, more than fair, and they both knew it. Tessa's land was not worth $6 an acre, not in its current condition. But Nathaniel was offering her a way to keep her home, to keep her independence, without making her feel like she was accepting charity. "Let me think about it," she said finally. "It is a big decision." "Of course," he said. "Take all the time you need." Then, with a slight smile, he added, "Though not more than 3 weeks." She laughed despite herself, and the sound seemed to please him. That evening, Nathaniel asked if she would like to see his cattle, and they walked out to the pasture where 50 head of prime beef stock grazed on good grass. He talked about his plans, his hopes, and Tessa found herself caught up in his enthusiasm. He wanted to build something that would last, something that could be passed down to future generations, and his vision was so clear and compelling that she could almost see it herself. When the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold, they stood together by the fence and watched the light fade. Nathaniel's arm was resting on the top rail, his shoulder nearly touching hers, and Tessa was acutely aware of his proximity, of the warmth of him and the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Tessa," he said quietly, his eyes still on the horizon, "I want you to know something. I have been thinking about how to say this for days, and I still do not have the right words, so I am just going to be honest." He turned to face her, and the intensity in his gaze made her throat go dry. "I am falling in love with you. I know it is fast, probably too fast, but I am not a man who does things halfway. When I see something I want, I go after it. And I want you. I want a life with you." Tessa's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Nathaniel, we have only known each other 2 weeks." "I know," he said. "And I am not asking you to marry me today. I am just asking you to consider the possibility, to let yourself imagine what it might be like if you said yes." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "I can give you security, Tessa. I can give you a home where you never have to worry about where the next meal is coming from. But more than that, I can give you partnership, respect. I would never try to make you into something you are not, and I would never expect you to shrink yourself to fit into my life. I want you exactly as you are." Tears were sliding down Tessa's cheeks now, and she made no effort to hide them. No one had ever said such things to her, had ever made her feel so valued, so seen. "What if I am not ready?" she whispered. "What if I am too broken from everything that has happened?" "Then I will wait," Nathaniel said simply. "And I will be here when you are ready. But Tessa, I do not think you are broken. I think you are bent, maybe, under the weight of carrying everything alone. But that is not the same thing, and given time and support, then things can straighten again." She looked up at him through her tears, at this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she had been too afraid to voice, and felt something inside her shift and settle. It was too fast, too sudden, but it also felt right in a way that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the bone-deep certainty that sometimes, rarely, life offered something good. "I am falling in love with you too," she said, the words shaking but true. "It terrifies me, but it is happening anyway." His smile was brilliant, and then he was pulling her close, wrapping his arms around her and holding her like she was something precious. Tessa pressed her face against his chest and let herself cry, let herself release all the fear and loneliness and desperate hope she had been carrying. And Nathaniel just held her, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring wordless comfort until the storm passed. When she finally pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, he produced a handkerchief from his pocket and handed it to her with such matter-of-fact kindness that she almost started crying again. "I must look a mess," she said, dabbing at her face. "You look perfect," he replied, and the sincerity in his voice made her believe him. They talked more as the stars came out, sitting on the porch steps of his house and planning, tentatively, what a future might look like. Nathaniel was adamant that Tessa should keep her land, all of it, and that he would find another way to help her meet the mortgage payment. She was equally adamant that she would not take his money without giving something in return, and they finally reached a compromise. He would lend her the $300 at a reasonable interest rate, and she would pay him back through a combination of sewing work and selling him water rights to the stream that ran through her property. It was not perfect, and Tessa knew she would still be in debt, but it was manageable. It was hope. When Nathaniel finally took her home that night, driving her wagon with his horse tied to the back, he walked her to her door and paused in the moonlight. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice low and rough with wanting. Tessa's breath caught, but she nodded, and then his hands were cupping her face and his mouth was on hers, gentle and seeking. The kiss was everything a first kiss should be, sweet and careful and full of promise, and when it ended, they stood forehead to forehead, breathing each other's air. "I will come by tomorrow," Nathaniel said. "We will go to the bank together and take care of the mortgage." "Together," Tessa repeated, tasting the word. She liked the sound of it. The next day they rode into Helena side by side, and if people stared and whispered, Tessa found she did not care. Nathaniel's presence beside her was like armor, and when they walked into the bank together, she felt stronger than she had in months. The bank manager, Mr. Thornton, Margaret's husband, looked surprised to see them but recovered quickly. "Miss Hamilton, Mr. Brooks, how may I help you today?" "I am here to make my mortgage payment," Tessa said, her voice steady. "In full." Nathaniel handed over the money, crisp bills counted out exactly, and Mr. Thornton recorded the payment with obvious reluctance. He had probably been looking forward to foreclosing, to buying the property cheap and reselling it at a profit. Now he would have to wait at least another year for his opportunity. "Payment received and recorded," he said stiffly, handing Tessa a receipt. "Your next payment is due in 12 months. They walked out together, and Tessa felt lighter than she had in years. The ranch was safe, at least for now, and she had a whole year to figure out how to keep it that way. The summer passed in a golden haze of work and courtship. Nathaniel was a frequent visitor to Tessa's ranch, often bringing supplies or simply arriving to help with tasks that were too much for one person. He fixed her fences, shored up the barn, and helped her expand her vegetable garden. In return, Tessa cooked him meals, mended his clothes, and slowly transformed his house into a home with small touches like embroidered pillowcases and a new tablecloth. They were building something together, slowly and carefully, and with each passing week, Tessa felt more certain that this was what she wanted. Nathaniel was steady and honest, hardworking and kind, and he made her laugh in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. In late August, he took her to a dance at the town hall, and Tessa wore her blue dress with her head held high. She knew people were still talking about them, speculating about when Nathaniel would propose, but she did not care. Let them talk. She was done living her life according to other people's expectations. Nathaniel was a surprisingly good dancer, and he held her close as they swayed to the music, his hand warm against the small of her back. "I want to ask you something," he said quietly, his mouth close to her ear. "And I want you to answer honestly." "All right," Tessa said, looking up at him. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Right now, in this moment, are you happy?" She considered the question seriously, taking stock of her life. The ranch was safe. She had work that brought in a steady income. She had friends again, people who smiled when they saw her rather than turning away. And she had Nathaniel, solid and real and choosing her every single day. "Yes," she said, and meant it completely. "I am happy." "Good," he said, and kissed her right there on the dance floor in front of everyone, as if he had every right to do so. Tessa kissed him back, her arms around his neck, and did not spare a single thought for what anyone else might think. In September, as the leaves began to turn and the air took on the crisp edge of coming autumn, Nathaniel asked Tessa to marry him. It happened not with grand gestures or elaborate planning, but on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when they were sitting on her porch watching a storm roll in over the mountains. "I spoke to Reverend Patterson yesterday," Nathaniel said casually, as if he were commenting on the weather. "He said he would be happy to marry us whenever we are ready. He also said I should probably actually propose first, rather than just assuming you will say yes." He turned to look at her, his gray-green eyes serious. "So, Tessa Hamilton, will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a rancher who loves you more than he ever thought possible? Will you build a life with me and let me spend every day trying to make you as happy as you make me?" Tessa felt tears welling up again, but this time they were purely joyful. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, Nathaniel Brooks, I will marry you." He pulled a ring from his pocket, simple silver with a small blue stone, and slid it onto her finger. "I know it is not much," he started to say, but she stopped him with a kiss. "It is perfect," she said. "You are perfect. All of this is perfect." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Helena, with Mrs. Anderson and Mr. Peterson standing as witnesses, and half the town crowded into the pews. Tessa wore a new dress she had made herself, white cotton with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs, and Nathaniel wore his best suit with a blue handkerchief in his pocket that matched her eyes. When Reverend Patterson pronounced them husband and wife, and Nathaniel kissed her, Tessa heard a few people clapping and a few more whispering. But she also heard genuine cheers, including Mrs. Anderson's loud whoop of approval, and she realized that somewhere along the way she had stopped caring what the Margaret Thorntons of the world thought about her. The reception was held at Mrs. Anderson's boarding house, and the table was laden with food that people had brought to celebrate. There were no grand speeches or elaborate toasts, just good food and honest fellowship, and Tessa thought it was the most perfect celebration she could have imagined. As the evening wore on and the guests began to leave, Nathaniel found her standing on Mrs. Anderson's porch, looking out at the town where she had been mocked and belittled just a few months before. "What are you thinking?" he asked, slipping his arm around her waist. "I am thinking about that day in the mercantile," Tessa said slowly, "about how terrible I felt, how small and worthless. And I am thinking about how you changed everything with just a few words." "You changed everything for yourself," Nathaniel corrected gently. "I just saw what was already there." "You saw me," Tessa said, turning to face him, "when no one else did. You looked past the worn dress and the failing ranch and saw something worth loving. That was a gift, Nathaniel, one I will never take for granted. And you took a chance on a stranger who had too much money and not enough sense to keep his mouth shut in public," he replied with a smile. "I would say we are even." They stayed at the boarding house that night, in a room Mrs. Anderson had prepared for them with fresh linens and wildflowers on the nightstand. It was their wedding night, and Tessa was nervous in the way of all new brides, but Nathaniel was patient and gentle, and when he loved her, it was with a tenderness that made her cry again. "Happy tears?" he asked, brushing them away with his thumb. "The happiest," she confirmed, and pulled him down for another kiss. The next day, they moved Tessa's belongings to Nathaniel's ranch, which was now her ranch too. She brought her mother's dishes, her father's tools, and the few precious items that carried memories of a life that had been hard but filled with love. Nathaniel helped her arrange everything, making space in his house for her things, and by evening the place felt like a true home for the first time. That first year of marriage was a period of adjustment and growth. They learned each other's rhythms, each other's habits, and they worked together to build the ranch into something profitable. Nathaniel bought more cattle with Tessa's input, respecting her knowledge of the land and the market. Tessa continued her sewing business, taking commissions from women across the territory and building a reputation for quality work. They also merged her small ranch with his larger spread, combining resources and creating a single operation that was stronger than either property had been alone. The stream that ran through Tessa's original 50 acres became a valuable water source for the expanded herd, and Nathaniel made sure that the paperwork clearly stated that Tessa owned half of everything, that this was a true partnership. In the spring, Tessa discovered she was pregnant. She told Nathaniel over breakfast on a morning when the world was bright and new and full of possibility, and the look of pure joy on his face was something she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. "A baby," he said, his voice awed. "We are going to have a baby." "We are," Tessa confirmed, taking his hand and pressing it against her still flat stomach. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Nathaniel said, and then he was kissing her, his hands cradling her face as if she were made of glass. The pregnancy was relatively easy, and Tessa worked almost up until the day she went into labor. The baby, a boy with his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's stubborn chin, was born in November, as snow began to fall across the Montana mountains. They named him Thomas, after Tessa's father, and he was healthy and loud and perfect. Nathaniel was an attentive father, rising in the night to help with feedings and changings, and he spoke to his son with the same seriousness he would have used with an adult. "You are going to do great things, Thomas Brooks," he would say, holding the baby against his chest. "And your mother and I are going to make sure you have every opportunity to find your own path." Tessa would watch them together, her husband and her son, and feel such overwhelming love that it sometimes frightened her. After so much loss, so much hardship, she had this: a family, a home, a future that stretched out bright and full of promise. The years passed, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. The ranch prospered under their joint management, growing into one of the most successful operations in the territory. Tessa's sewing business evolved into something more, and she began designing clothes for women across Montana, shipping her creations as far away as Denver and San Francisco. They had 2 more children, a daughter they named Catherine, who had Tessa's blue eyes and Nathaniel's easy smile, and another son, Marcus, who was curious and adventurous and kept them constantly on their toes. Through it all, Nathaniel and Tessa remained partners in the truest sense. They made decisions together, supported each other through difficult times, and celebrated each victory no matter how small. They argued sometimes because they were both strong-willed and passionate, but they always came back together with respect and love intact. When Thomas was 5 years old, they expanded the ranch house, adding rooms for the growing family and a large kitchen where Tessa could work on her designs. Nathaniel built her a sewing room with windows that faced south, giving her the best light, and he filled it with supplies and fabrics that he ordered from catalogs, wanting her to have everything she needed. "You do not have to do this," Tessa told him as she surveyed the room, overwhelmed by his generosity. "I know," Nathaniel replied, "but I want to. Your work is important, Tessa. It brings you joy and it brings income, but more than that, it is part of who you are. I would never want you to give that up just because you are also a wife and mother." She kissed him then, deep and thorough, and later that night after the children were asleep, she showed him with her body how much his support meant to her. On their 10th anniversary, Nathaniel took Tessa back to the mercantile where they had first met. It had been renovated in the years since, expanded and improved, and Mr. Peterson had retired, leaving the store to his son. "Why are we here?" Tessa asked, confused but willing to go along with whatever Nathaniel had planned. "Because this is where it started," Nathaniel said simply. "This is where I saw you for the first time and knew my life was about to change." He led her to the spot where he had first spoken those words that had altered everything. "I told you then that you made that worn dress look like royalty. I want to tell you now that you have made every single day since then feel like a gift. You have given me a family, a home, a purpose beyond just building wealth. You have made me a better man, Tessa, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." Tessa was crying, of course, because how could she not when the man she loved said things like that? "You are already worthy," she managed to say through her tears. "You have always been worthy, Nathaniel, from that very first day when you stood up for me when no one else would." They stood there in the mercantile, holding each other as customers moved around them with understanding smiles, and Tessa thought about how much had changed in 10 years. The girl who had walked into this store in a worn dress, broken and desperate, was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her own strength, who had built a life beyond anything she had dared to dream. As they walked out into the bright afternoon, Tessa saw Margaret Thornton across the street. The woman who had mocked her all those years ago now lived in genteel poverty, her husband having gambled away most of their money before his death 3 years prior. Their eyes met, and for just a moment, Tessa considered looking away, avoiding the confrontation. But then Nathaniel's hand tightened on hers, and she felt the weight of his support, his love, and she found she could not look away. Instead, Tessa nodded politely, a gesture that held no malice but also no particular warmth, and kept walking. She had learned over the years that the best revenge was not cruelty, but rather living well, building something real and lasting while others tore themselves apart with pettiness and pride. The ranch continued to thrive as the children grew. Thomas showed an early aptitude for working with cattle, understanding the animals in a way that suggested he would carry on the family business when the time came. Catherine was artistic, her drawings and sketches showing genuine talent, and Tessa encouraged her daughter to pursue that gift while also teaching her practical skills. Marcus, the youngest, was still finding his way, interested in everything and committed to nothing, but Nathaniel assured Tessa that the boy would settle eventually. "He is only 7, Nathaniel would say with a laugh when Tessa worried. "Let him explore. He will find his passion in time." As the 1890s arrived, bringing with them the slow end of the Wild West era and the beginnings of modern Montana, Nathaniel and Tessa adapted their operation to meet changing times. They invested in better breeding stock, upgraded their equipment, and even purchased one of the new steam-powered tractors that were beginning to revolutionize farming and ranching. But despite the changes swirling around them, some things remained constant. Every Sunday, they still attended church together as a family, taking up an entire pew with their growing children. Every evening, weather permitting, they still sat on the porch together after the children were in bed, talking about their day and making plans for tomorrow. On one such evening, when they had been married for 15 years, and their hair was beginning to show threads of silver, Tessa asked Nathaniel if he ever regretted the way they had met, if he ever wished for something more conventional. He looked at her as if she had asked if he regretted breathing. "Regret meeting you, regret defending you when you needed defending. Tessa, that day in the mercantile was the best day of my life until the day you agreed to marry me." He took her hand, his thumb tracing the silver ring she still wore, the blue stone still bright. If I could go back and do it all again, I would not change a single thing. Every moment, every choice, every word led me to you. How could I possibly regret that?" Tessa leaned against his shoulder, fitting into his side the way she always had, the way she always would. "I love you, Nathaniel Brooks. I have loved you since the moment you looked at me and saw someone worth defending. I will love you until the day I die." "And I will love you beyond that," Nathaniel replied, kissing the top of her head. "Into whatever comes after, if there is an after. You are written into my soul, Tessa. Nothing can change that." As the stars came out over the Montana mountains, casting silver light across the ranch they had built together, Tessa felt a peace so profound it was almost like prayer. This was what she had been searching for all those years ago, when life had seemed impossible and hope had felt like a luxury she could not afford. Not rescue, not charity, but partnership. Love. Home. The worn dress was long gone, donated to someone who needed it more, but Tessa had kept a scrap of the fabric as a reminder. On days when things were difficult, when the weight of running a business and raising children felt overwhelming, she would take out that faded piece of cloth and remember. She would remember standing in a mercantile with her head held high despite the mockery. She would remember a cowboy's voice cutting through the cruelty with simple, honest truth. She would remember that sometimes, in the middle of your worst moment, grace can arrive in the most unexpected form. Years continued to pass, each one adding new layers to the story of their life together. Thomas grew into a fine young man and eventually took over more of the daily ranch operations, though Nathaniel remained active and involved. Catherine married a teacher from Helena and moved into town, but she visited often, bringing her own children to run wild on the ranch where she had grown up. Marcus, true to his wandering nature, became a surveyor, traveling across the state mapping new territories. But he always came home for Christmas and the family reunions Tessa insisted on hosting. On their 25th anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There were nearly 30 people now, when you counted spouses and grandchildren, and the house rang with laughter and music. Tessa, her dark blonde hair now thoroughly streaked with silver, moved through the crowd accepting congratulations and basking in the warmth of being surrounded by people she loved. Nathaniel found her in the kitchen, where she had retreated for a moment of quiet, and pulled her into his arms. 25 years, he said, his voice still strong despite the lines on his face and the silver in his beard. A quarter of a century of being married to the most remarkable woman I have ever known. Remarkable, Tessa teased, though she was pleased. I am just a ranch wife who knows how to sew. You are a businesswoman who built an empire with needle and thread, Nathaniel corrected. You are a mother who raised 3 incredible children. You are a partner who has stood beside me through droughts and hard winters and market crashes. You are the love of my life, Tessa. You always have been, and you always will be. She kissed him then, not caring that people might see, not caring about anything except the feeling of his arms around her and the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The party continued late into the night, and when the last guest had finally departed and the house was quiet again, Nathaniel and Tessa stood on the porch looking out at the land they had worked so hard to build. The moon was full, casting everything in silver, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, its voice lonely and wild. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Tessa asked, not for the first time. "Do you ever wonder how different things might have been if you had just walked past me in that mercantile?" "Never," Nathaniel said firmly. "Because I did not walk past. I saw you, I spoke up, and I made the best decision of my life." He turned to face her, his hands on her shoulders. "Everything I have, Everything I am is because of you. The ranch, the family, the life we have built. None of it would mean anything if I could not share it with you." Tessa felt tears gathering, but they were good tears, the kind that came from too much happiness rather than too much pain. "I used to think that day in the mercantile was the worst day of my life," she said softly. "I was so ashamed, so broken, but now I see it differently. It was not the worst day. It was the beginning of the best days. It was the day I met you." They stood together in the moonlight, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something that would outlast them both. In the years to come, their grandchildren would ask about how they met, and Tessa would tell the story of the worn dress and the cowboy who said it looked like royalty. She would tell it with pride, not shame, because it was a story about dignity and kindness and the way love can appear when you least expect it. And every time she told it, Nathaniel would be there beside her, adding details and making her laugh, and they would look at each other with the kind of understanding that only comes from years of truly knowing someone. They had started with nothing but hope and ended with everything that mattered. As they finally turned to go inside, Tessa took one last look at the mountains, at the land that had tested them and ultimately accepted them, and she whispered a thank you to whoever might be listening. Thank you for the hard times that taught her strength. Thank you for the moment of humiliation that led to grace. Thank you for the cowboy with the honest eyes who saw past appearances to the woman beneath. Most of all, thank you for the life they had built together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, until those days and choices had accumulated into something beautiful and lasting and true. The years that followed were quieter but no less rich. Nathaniel and Tessa gradually handed over more responsibilities to Thomas and his wife, though they remained active on the ranch and involved in the community. They traveled a bit, taking a train to San Francisco to see the ocean and visiting Catherine and Helena whenever they could. But they always came back to the ranch, to the home they had built, because that was where their roots went deep. On a cool autumn evening when Nathaniel was 72 and Tessa was 68, they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Nathaniel's health had been failing slowly, his heart not as strong as it once was, but he remained sharp and engaged, still passionate about the ranch and the family. "I have been thinking," he said, his voice rougher than it used to be but still warm, "about what comes after. About what I want to leave behind." Tessa took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that had become automatic over the decades. "You are leaving behind a legacy," she said firmly. "A family that loves you, a ranch that will continue for generations, a life well lived." "I am leaving behind you," he said, turning to look at her. "That is what worries me, Tessa. When I am gone, I need to know you will be all right." She had known this conversation was coming, had seen it approaching like another storm on the horizon. "I will be all right," she promised, though the thought of a world without him was almost unbearable. "You taught me how to be strong, Nathaniel. You showed me that I could stand on my own 2 feet and build something real. I will miss you every day for the rest of my life, but I will be all right because you loved me enough to make sure I knew my own strength." He smiled, and it was the same smile that had captured her heart all those years ago in a dusty mercantile. "You always knew your own strength," he corrected gently. "I just reminded you when you had forgotten." They sat there as the sun sank below the mountains, and the stars began to appear, holding hands and remembering. They remembered the early days when everything was new and uncertain. They remembered the birth of their children and the growth of the ranch. They remembered arguments and reconciliations, hardships and triumphs, and all the small moments that had woven together to create a marriage that had lasted nearly 5 decades. Nathaniel died 3 months later, peacefully in his sleep with Tessa beside him. The funeral was attended by seemingly half of Montana, ranchers and business people and friends, who had known him as a man of integrity and honor. Thomas gave the eulogy, his voice breaking as he spoke of a father who had taught him the value of hard work and honest dealing. Catherine read a poem, her artistic sensibility finding beauty even in grief. Marcus, who had ridden for 3 days straight to make it home in time, stood with his arm around his mother and tried to be strong. But it was Tessa who truly said goodbye. After everyone else had left, after the last guest had departed and the house was quiet, she returned to the cemetery alone. She stood before the fresh grave and spoke to the man who had been her partner, her lover, her best friend. "You kept your promise," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "You made me happy. Every single day for 47 years, you made me feel loved and valued and seen. You took a woman in a worn dress and showed her she was royalty, and then you spent the rest of your life proving it." She placed her hand flat against the cold stone that marked his resting place. "I will miss you until the day I join you, Nathaniel Brooks, but I will not break. You made sure of that. You built me up so strong that not even losing you can break me down." Tessa lived another 8 years, remaining active in the ranch and watching her grandchildren grow into adults who carried forward the values Nathaniel had instilled. She continued her sewing work until arthritis made it impossible. And even then, she designed patterns and supervised others who brought her visions to life. She spoke of Nathaniel often, keeping his memory alive for the youngest grandchildren who had never known him. She told them about the mercantile, about the worn dress, about the cowboy who saw past appearances to the person beneath. She told them that love was not always convenient or easy, but it was always worth fighting for. On a spring morning when the mountains were green and the wildflowers were blooming across the meadows, Tessa Hamilton Brooks passed away in her sleep at the age of 76. She was buried beside Nathaniel, their graves marked with simple stones that bore their names and the dates of their lives, along with a single inscription that Thomas had chosen. Together, they built something lasting. The ranch continued under Thomas's management, and then his son after him, and it remained in the Brooks family for generations. The house was updated and expanded, but the core structure that Nathaniel had built remained, a testament to solid craftsmanship and careful planning. In the main hallway, preserved behind glass, hung a scrap of faded fabric in a color that might once have been blue, along with a small plaque that told the story of Tessa Hamilton and the cowboy who saw her worth. Tourists who visited the ranch, which eventually opened a portion of its land to guest visitors, would pause before that display and read the story. They would smile at the romance of it, at the idea of love appearing in the middle of humiliation and transforming everything. Some would understand that it was more than just a romantic story, that it was a testament to the power of seeing people for who they truly are rather than for what circumstances have made them appear to be. And on quiet evenings when the wind blew down from the mountains and the ranch was settling in for the night, some claimed they could see 2 figures standing on the porch of the old house, holding hands and watching the sunset. They were just shadows, probably nothing more than tricks of the light, but those who believed in such things liked to think it was Nathaniel and Tessa, still together, still building their life one moment at a time. The story of the worn dress and the cowboy who declared it royalty became part of Montana folklore, told and retold until it took on the quality of legend. But for those who had known them, for the family who carried their blood and their values forward into each new generation, it was simply the truth. It was the story of 2 people who found each other when they both needed finding, who built something lasting out of love and hard work and unwavering commitment. It was a story about dignity in the face of mockery, about kindness when cruelty would have been easier, about seeing the best in people even when circumstances have worn them down. It was a story about second chances and new beginnings and the incredible power of simple, honest love. Most importantly, it was a story that had a happy ending, not because everything was perfect, but because two people chose each other every single day and built a life that mattered. They raised children who became good adults. They ran a ranch that prospered and provided for generations. They loved each other through good times and bad, through poverty and prosperity, through youth and age. And in the end, when both had passed from this world to whatever lies beyond, they left behind something that could not be taken away by death or time. They left behind a legacy of love, a family that knew the value of loyalty and hard work, and a story that would be told for generations to come. Tessa Hamilton had walked into a mercantile in a worn dress, broken and ashamed, and walked out with her head held high because a stranger had reminded her of her worth. Nathaniel Brooks had seen a woman in need of defending and spoken up without thought for the consequences, acting on instinct and honor. From that single moment of grace, an entire life had unfolded, complete with all the joy and sorrow and ordinary magic that makes up a human existence. It was not a fairy tale, though it had elements of one. It was better than a fairy tale because it was real, because it had happened to real people who struggled and triumphed and built something lasting with their own hands. The worn dress was long gone, returned to dust like everything mortal must eventually be. But the love it had inadvertently sparked lived on, carried forward in the hearts and memories of everyone who had been touched by Nathaniel and Tessa's story. In Helena, Montana, where it had all begun, the mercantile was eventually torn down and replaced with a more modern building. But a small historical marker was placed on the site, commemorating what had happened there on that summer day in 1882. It told the story simply, without embellishment, and it ended with the words that had changed everything. "You make it look like royalty." Those words, spoken in defense of a woman who needed defending, had rippled outward like stones dropped in still water. They had created waves that touched dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of lives as the story was passed down and shared. They had reminded people that kindness matters, that speaking up matters, that seeing the best in others can change not just one life but many. And so the story ends where it began, with a worn dress and a cowboy and a moment of grace in a dusty Montana mercantile. But it also extends far beyond that moment, encompassing decades of love and work and family, a legacy that lived on long after the original players had left the stage. It was a story of the Wild West, but also a story that could happen anywhere in any time, because human nature does not change much. We all need to be seen, to be valued, to be reminded of our worth. And we all have the power to be like Nathaniel Brooks, to speak up when we see injustice, to defend those who need defending, to see past appearances to the person beneath. That is the real magic of the story, the reason it endured. Not because it was particularly unusual or dramatic, but because it was fundamentally about the best parts of human nature. It was about choosing love over indifference, kindness over cruelty, truth over convenience. It was about building something that would last, not through grand gestures but through small, daily choices made over and over again, until they accumulated into a life worth living. Tessa and Nathaniel had lived that life together, and when it ended they could look back without regret, knowing they had made the most of the time they were given. They had loved deeply, worked hard, raised their children well, and left the world a little better than they found it. What more could anyone ask from a life? What greater legacy could anyone leave? As the sun sets over the Montana mountains one final time in this telling, we leave the Brooks family ranch in good hands, carried forward by people who understand its value and its history. We leave Tessa and Nathaniel at rest, together as they always were, their story complete. And we carry forward the lesson they taught through their example, that dignity and kindness and honest love are never out of fashion, never obsolete, never anything less than the most important things in the world. The worn dress is gone, but its story remains. The cowboy is gone, but his words echo down through the years. And the love they shared, the life they built, the family they raised, all of it continues, permanent and real and true. That is how stories work when they are good ones. They do not end when the people in them die. They continue, passed down and remembered, teaching new generations the same lessons the originals learned. And this story, of the woman in the worn dress and the cowboy who saw her worth, will continue for as long as people believe in the power of love to transform, the importance of kindness to uplift, and the absolute necessity of seeing each other clearly, with generosity and grace. It is a story of the Wild West, but it is also a story for all times and all places. It is, quite simply, a story about being human in the best possible way, and that never goes out of style.